The champagne glass slipped from my hand and shattered across the marble floor of the penthouse, the exact moment I saw Margaret kissing Daniel on the rooftop terrace. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I watched my girlfriend of 7 years press her body against my best friend, while the entire city of Manhattan glittered behind them like a cruel joke. The engagement ring I had saved 3 years to buy sat heavy in my jacket pocket, suddenly feeling like a stone tied to a drowning man. Daniel's hand moved to the small of her back in a gesture, so familiar it made my stomach turn because that was how I used to hold her, before he came back into our lives 6 months ago with his inherited fortune, and that insufferable smile. I had introduced them at my birthday party like an idiot, thinking my childhood friend, and the woman I loved, would simply get along for my sake. Instead, I had handed her over to him on a silver platter, and he had taken her without a second thought. The worst part was not even the betrayal itself, but the fact that Margaret had looked happier in those 3 seconds of kissing Daniel than she had in our entire last year together. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I knew without looking it would be her text saying she would be late again, saying she was working overtime at the gallery, saying anything except the truth. I turned away from the window and walked straight out of Daniel's birthday party that I had foolishly helped organize, leaving behind the gift I had bought him and the future I had imagined with Margaret. My name is Robert Chen, and I grew up in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in Queens where the smell of my mother's dumplings mixed with the sound of the elevated train rattling past every 15 minutes. My father had died when I was 12 years old, leaving my mother to raise me alone on her seamstress salary while she sewed wedding dresses for wealthy women in Manhattan. I learned early that life was not fair and that some people were born on third base, while others had to claw their way just to get into the stadium. I met Daniel Park in the 6th grade when his family still lived in our neighborhood before his uncle died and left them a commercial real estate empire worth $200 million. Back then, Daniel was just another kid with holes in his sneakers and a chip on his shoulder about being poor. We became best friends because we understood each other in a way that only people who have gone hungry can understand. We promised each other that someday we would make it out of Queens and never look back. When Daniel's family moved to the Upper East Side after the inheritance, everything changed, but I told myself our friendship was stronger than money. I met Margaret Liu in college at a coffee shop near Columbia University, where I was studying architecture on a full scholarship and working 3 part-time jobs to afford textbooks. She was an art history major with long black hair and eyes that seemed to hold entire galaxies when she talked about Renaissance paintings. Margaret came from a comfortable middle-class family in Boston, nothing spectacular but stable and secure in a way my childhood never was. She said she liked that I was ambitious and hardworking, that I had dreams bigger than my circumstances. We fell in love slowly over late-night study sessions and cheap pizza and walks through Central Park, where we would imagine the buildings I would design someday. Margaret believed in me when I was nobody, and that meant everything. For 7 years we built a life together in a small studio apartment in Brooklyn, where we hung her art prints on the walls, and saved every penny toward a future that felt just within reach. I worked at a mid-sized architecture firm, making decent money, but nothing extraordinary, while Margaret worked as an assistant curator at a contemporary art gallery. We were happy, or at least I thought we were happy, until Daniel came back. 6 months ago, Daniel called me out of nowhere, saying he was back in New York permanently after spending 5 years in Singapore, managing his family's overseas properties. He said he missed his best friend and wanted to reconnect. I was genuinely happy to hear from him because despite the money and the distance, some part of me still remembered the kid who used to share his lunch with me when my mom could not afford the school cafeteria. I invited him to my 29th birthday party at our apartment, and introduced him to Margaret and to my colleagues from work and to the small circle of friends we had built over the years. Daniel showed up in a custom-tailored suit with a bottle of wine that cost more than my monthly rent and that effortless charm that wealthy people seem to develop like a second skin. He complimented Margaret on her dress and asked thoughtful questions about her work at the gallery and told funny stories about his time in Asia that had everyone laughing. I remember feeling proud that night, proud to have a successful friend, proud to show him the life I had built, proud that despite our different paths, we could still connect. That was my first mistake. The changes started small, so small that I convinced myself I was imagining things. Margaret began mentioning Daniel in casual conversation, how he had stopped by the gallery to see an exhibition, how he had recommended a restaurant where we should celebrate our anniversary, how he had offered to introduce her to a collector who might be interested in her gallery's artists. She started dressing differently, trading her usual comfortable style for designer labels that I knew she could not afford on her salary. When I asked about the new clothes, she said they were gifts from her boss or that she had found them on sale, but her eyes would not quite meet mine when she said it. She came home later and later from work, always with explanations that sounded reasonable but felt hollow. The gallery was preparing for a major show, she said, or she had drinks with colleagues, she said, or there was an important client dinner, she said. I wanted to believe her because the alternative was too painful to consider. Then came the night I decided to surprise her at the gallery with takeout from her favorite Thai restaurant, only to find the building dark and locked with a security guard who told me everyone had left hours ago. I called her phone, and she answered slightly breathless, saying she was still at work and could not talk. I could hear music and voices in the background, the unmistakable sound of a bar or restaurant. When I pressed her about it, she got defensive, saying I was being paranoid and controlling and that she needed space to breathe. We had our first real fight that night, screaming at each other in our tiny apartment, while the neighbors pounded on the walls. She accused me of not trusting her and I accused her of lying, and neither of us was completely wrong. I wanted to confront Daniel, but every time I tried to bring it up, Margaret would deflect or change the subject or accuse me of being jealous of his success. Maybe she was right, maybe I was jealous. How could I compete with a man who could buy her anything she wanted, who could take her to exclusive restaurants and private gallery openings, who represented everything I was trying to become but had not achieved yet? I threw myself into work, staying late at the office, and taking on extra projects, hoping that if I could just land one major client or win one important design competition, then maybe I could prove I was worthy of her. But architecture is a slow burn career, and success does not happen overnight no matter how hard you work. 3 months ago, Margaret started talking about taking a break from our relationship, saying we had been together since we were so young and maybe we needed time apart to figure out what we really wanted. I begged her to reconsider, promising I would be better somehow, even though I was not sure what I was doing wrong. She agreed to stay, but things between us grew cold and distant, like living with a polite stranger instead of the woman I loved. We stopped having sex, stopped going on dates, stopped talking about anything that mattered. I would wake up in the middle of the night and find her texting someone with a small smile on her face that disappeared the moment she noticed I was awake. When I asked who she was talking to, she said it was just a friend from work, but she would not show me her phone. 2 weeks ago, Daniel invited me to lunch at an expensive steakhouse in Midtown where the prices were not even listed on the menu. He ordered us scotch that was older than we were and talked about his latest real estate acquisition in Brooklyn, an entire apartment building that he was converting into luxury condos. Then he casually mentioned that he was looking for an architect to redesign the lobby and common spaces, and he wanted to give me the opportunity. It was the kind of project that could make my career, the kind of commission that would finally put my name on the map in New York architecture circles. I was so excited that I did not stop to wonder why my best friend was suddenly offering me this golden opportunity out of nowhere. We shook hands, and he smiled that easy smile, and I felt like maybe everything was going to be okay after all. That night I told Margaret about the project, and she seemed genuinely happy for me, the first real smile I had seen from her in weeks. I thought maybe this was the turning point, maybe landing this big client would prove to her that I was going places, that she should stay with me. I spent the next 2 weeks working day and night on the proposal, pouring everything I had into the design concepts and presentation materials. I wanted it to be perfect, not just because it was a career-defining opportunity, but because I wanted to prove to Daniel and to Margaret and to myself that I deserved to be in their world. The night of Daniel's birthday party, I arrived early to help set up like he had asked. His penthouse in Tribeca was the kind of place that belonged in architecture, magazines, all exposed brick and floor-to-ceiling windows, and minimalist furniture that probably cost more than my annual salary. I was arranging champagne flutes on the bar when Melissa walked in, carrying a tray of catered appetizers. Melissa Tran was Daniel's executive assistant, a quiet, efficient woman in her late 20s, who always seemed to be hovering in the background, making sure everything ran smoothly. We had met a few times at Daniel's social events, and she had always been polite but distant in the way that people who work for wealthy bosses learn to be invisible. She set down the tray, and glanced at me with an expression I could not quite read. "You seem nervous," she said. I laughed awkwardly and admitted I was hoping to give Daniel my final proposal for the Brooklyn project tonight at the party. Melissa's face did something strange, a flicker of what might have been pity or concern before her professional mask slipped back into place. "Robert," she said quietly, "can I talk to you about something?" Before she could continue, Daniel walked in with Margaret on his arm, both of them laughing at some private joke, and my stomach dropped. Margaret was wearing a dress I had never seen before, something elegant and expensive that hugged her body in ways that made me feel like a stranger looking at her. Daniel's hand rested casually on her lower back in that familiar gesture, and suddenly everything clicked into place with horrible clarity. I managed to get through the next hour on autopilot, greeting guests and making small talk while my mind raced. I kept waiting for Margaret to come over to acknowledge my presence, to act like my girlfriend, but she stayed by Daniel's side all night like she belonged there. Around 9 o'clock I went looking for her and found the rooftop terrace door slightly ajar. That was when I saw them through the window kissing under the fairy lights that Daniel had strung up for the party. Margaret's arms were around his neck and his hands were on her waist, and they looked like they had done this 1,000 times before. The engagement ring in my pocket suddenly felt like evidence of my own stupidity. I do not remember walking out of the party or taking the subway back to Brooklyn. I just remember sitting in our apartment surrounded by all the things Margaret and I had accumulated together over 7 years and feeling like I was drowning. Her art books on the shelf, the coffee mugs we had bought on a weekend trip to Portland, the photograph of us at Coney Island laughing with ice cream on our noses. All of it felt like artifacts from someone else's life now. Around midnight she came home and I was waiting on the couch with the lights off. "We need to talk," I said, and she froze in the doorway like an animal caught in headlights. "Robert, I can explain," she started, but I held up my hand. "How long?" I asked. She closed her eyes. 3 months, she whispered. 3 months. While I had been working myself to exhaustion, trying to provide for our future, she had been building a new life with my best friend. While I had been worrying about our relationship and trying to fix whatever was wrong, she had already decided I was not enough. The betrayal cut deeper than I had words for, because it was not just Margaret who had chosen someone else, it was Daniel who had taken her, knowing exactly what he was doing. "Did he offer you the Brooklyn project just to keep me distracted?" I asked, and her silence was answer enough. Margaret tried to explain, tried to say that she had not meant for it to happen, that she loved Daniel and could not help her feelings, that she was sorry but she had to follow her heart. I listened to her talk about following her heart like I was some obstacle she had to get past instead of the man who had loved her through everything. When she finally stopped talking, I asked her to leave. She started to argue, but something in my face must have convinced her I was serious. She grabbed some clothes and her laptop and walked out, leaving me alone in the apartment that suddenly felt cavernous and empty. The next morning I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years and spent the day staring at the ceiling trying to make sense of what had happened. My phone kept buzzing with messages from Margaret, saying we needed to talk about logistics, and Daniel asking if I was okay because I had left the party without saying goodbye. The audacity of that message almost made me laugh. Around noon Melissa showed up at my door holding a cardboard box and looking uncomfortable. "I did not order anything," I said, confused. She shook her head. "These are yours from Daniel's office. Your proposal and some other things. He wanted me to return them." I opened the box right there in the hallway and found my carefully prepared proposal materials along with a formal letter, explaining that Daniel had decided to go with a different architect for the Brooklyn project. The letter was polite and professional, thanking me for my time and wishing me well in my future endeavors like I was some random contractor instead of his supposed best friend. I must have made some sound because Melissa put her hand on my arm. "I am sorry, Robert," she said. "I tried to warn you last night." I looked at her, really looked at her for the first time, and saw genuine sympathy in her eyes. "What do you mean?" I asked. Melissa glanced down the hallway like she was checking for witnesses, then stepped into my apartment and closed the door. "I have worked for Daniel for 2 years, she said, and I have seen him do this before. There was a woman in Singapore, a business rival's girlfriend. Daniel pursued her, convinced her to leave her boyfriend, and once he got what he wanted, he lost interest. It is like a game to him, proving he can take whatever he wants." She paused. "He started talking about Margaret the night after your birthday party. He said she was too good for you, that she deserved someone who could give her the life she wanted. I thought about saying something, but it was not my place and I needed my job." The room spun slightly as I processed this. "You are saying he pursued Margaret just to prove he could?" Melissa nodded. "I have heard him on the phone with his friends bragging about it. He called it a challenge." "And the Brooklyn project?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "There never was a project," she said quietly. "I mean, there is a building, and he is renovating it, but he already has an architect. He just dangled that opportunity in front of you to keep you distracted while he moved in on Margaret." "I am sorry." I asked her why she was telling me this now, and she said, "Because you seem like a decent person and you deserve to know the truth. Also, because I handed in my resignation this morning. I cannot work for someone like that anymore." After Melissa left, I sat with that information trying to decide what to do with it. Part of me wanted to call Margaret immediately to warn her that she had left me for a man who was playing games with her life. But another part of me, the part that was hurt and angry and betrayed, thought maybe she deserved to learn this lesson the hard way. I compromised by sending her a single text asking her to meet me for coffee. She agreed immediately, probably thinking I wanted closure or to beg her to come back. We met at the same coffee shop where we had first fallen in love 10 years ago, and the irony of that was not lost on me. Margaret looked tired but also happy in a way I had not seen in months. She started to apologize, but I cut her off. "I am not here to fight," I said. "I just want to know one thing. Does Daniel know you are meeting me?" She frowned. "No, why would he?" I nodded slowly. "Because from what I understand, he does not like you having any independence." Margaret laughed like I had said something ridiculous. That is not true at all. He is the one who encouraged me to meet you to get closure. I pulled out my phone and showed her screenshots that Melissa had sent me that morning, text messages between Daniel and his friend where he referred to Margaret as his latest acquisition and joked about how easy it had been to steal her from me. Margaret's face went pale as she read them. These could be fake, she said, but her voice shook. They are not, I said, and you know it. But you will have to figure that out on your own. I stood up to leave and she grabbed my wrist. Robert, wait. I looked down at her hand on my arm and then at her face. I loved you, Margaret. I really did. I hope he is everything you thought he would be. Then I walked out, leaving her sitting there with my phone. I spent the next month rebuilding my life, or at least trying to. I threw myself into freelance work, taking on small residential projects and design consultations to keep myself busy and pay the bills. I moved out of the Brooklyn apartment because every corner reminded me of Margaret and found a tiny studio in Washington Heights that was basically a glorified closet, but it was mine alone. My mother called every day to check on me and I lied and told her I was fine, even though I was barely sleeping and had lost 15 pounds because I kept forgetting to eat. She did not believe me, but she was wise enough not to push. Friends from work tried to set me up on dates, but I was not ready to trust anyone new yet. The wound was too fresh. Margaret texted me a few times in those first weeks, saying she had confronted Daniel and he had explained everything, and I was just jealous and trying to ruin her happiness. I did not respond. Then the texts changed tone, becoming more confused and questioning. She said Daniel had become controlling about who she spent time with and what she wore and where she went. She said he had convinced her to quit her job at the gallery because he wanted to support her fully, and she was starting to feel isolated. She asked if we could talk and I told her, no. I had tried to warn her and she had chosen not to believe me. Whatever happened now was between her and Daniel. 2 months after the breakup, I ran into Melissa at a bookstore in the village. She had landed a new job as an event coordinator for a nonprofit and seemed happier than I had ever seen her. We got coffee and talked for hours about everything except Daniel and Margaret. Melissa was smart and funny and easy to talk to in a way that felt refreshing after years of walking on eggshells in my relationship. She did not play games or send mixed signals. When she laughed, it was genuine, and when she said something, she meant it. We started meeting for coffee regularly, then for dinner, then for long walks through the city where we would talk about our dreams and our pasts and the things we wanted out of life. I was not looking for a relationship, but somehow, Melissa slipped past my defenses and made me believe that maybe not everyone would betray me. 3 months after the breakup, Melissa and I were having dinner at a small Italian restaurant in the West Village when Margaret walked in with Daniel. I saw her before she saw me and my first instinct was to leave, but Melissa put her hand on mine. You have every right to be here, she said firmly. So we stayed. When Margaret finally noticed us, her face went through a series of expressions: shock, hurt, anger, confusion. Daniel followed her gaze, and for a moment our eyes met across the restaurant. He smiled that insufferable smile and raised his glass to me in a mocking toast. Melissa squeezed my hand and I squeezed back, grateful for her steady presence. We finished our meal and left without acknowledging them. As we walked past their table, I heard Daniel say something to Margaret in a low voice and she flinched like he had struck her. That night, Margaret called me crying. She said Daniel had been furious that I was at the restaurant, that he accused her of still being in love with me and had made a scene in front of everyone. She said he had grabbed her arm hard enough to bruise and then left her there without a ride home. She begged me to come get her and against my better judgment I went. I found her sitting on a bench outside the restaurant, mascara running down her face, looking small and broken. I drove her to her apartment, well, Daniel's apartment, where she had been living, and she asked me to come up. I said no. Margaret started crying harder, saying she had made a terrible mistake, that I had been right about Daniel, that she missed me and wanted to come home. I looked at this woman who had once been my entire world and felt nothing but a distant sadness. You do not have a home with me anymore, Margaret. You made your choice. She grabbed my jacket. Please, Robert, I will do anything. I was so stupid. He is not who I thought he was. He controls everything I do. He reads my texts and tracks my location and gets angry if I talk to anyone he does not approve of. I am scared. I should have felt vindicated hearing this, but instead I just felt tired. You need to leave him, I said, but you need to do it for yourself, not because you want me back. She looked at me with desperate hope. Does that mean there is a chance for us? I shook my head. No, Margaret. That part of my life is over. I have moved on. She saw something in my expression. It is that woman from the restaurant, is not it? Melissa, I said, and even saying her name felt like a small act of defiance. Yes. Her name is Melissa, and she is kind and honest and she does not play games. Everything you used to be before Daniel. Margaret's face crumpled. So you replaced me. I almost laughed at the absurdity. You replaced me first, remember? The difference is Melissa actually cares about me. She did not pursue me to win some sick game. She just saw me as a person worth knowing. Margaret got out of the car without another word, and I drove away. I thought that would be the end of it, but I was wrong. 1 week later I got a call from an unknown number at 2 in the morning. I almost did not answer, but something made me pick up. "Robert, this is Melissa's," voice came through, shaky and scared. "I need your help." I was instantly awake. "What is wrong?" "I am at Margaret's Daniel's building. You need to come now." I did not ask questions, just threw on clothes and rushed to Tribeca, arriving in less than 20 minutes. I found Melissa standing outside the building with Margaret, who was holding a single suitcase, and had a visible bruise on her cheek. "What happened?" I demanded, looking between them. Melissa spoke first. "She called me tonight. Daniel hit her and she did not know who else to reach out to." Margaret would not meet my eyes. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I did not want to drag you into this, but I have no money and nowhere to go. He took my phone and my credit cards." I felt my anger at her war with my basic human decency. "We need to call the police," I said. "No," Margaret said quickly. "You do not understand. His family has lawyers and money. If I report him, he will destroy me. He said he would ruin my career, make sure I never work in the art world again. He has connections everywhere." I looked at Melissa, who nodded. "I have seen him do it before. He crushed a former business partner who crossed him. We need to be smart about this." Against every instinct telling me to stay out of it, I brought Margaret to my tiny studio apartment and set her up on the couch. Melissa stayed too, and the three of us sat in my cramped kitchen trying to figure out what to do. Margaret told us everything about how Daniel's charm had slowly morphed into control, about how he had isolated her from friends and family, about how he would be loving and generous one moment and cold and cruel the next. She said he had been cheating on her for at least a month with multiple women, and when she confronted him, he had laughed and said she should be grateful he kept her around at all. She said he told her she was nothing without him, that she had burned all her bridges and had nowhere to go, and she had believed him until tonight when he had slapped her and she finally saw him clearly. I wanted to feel satisfaction at being proven right, but watching this broken version of Margaret was just depressing. Melissa, who had more experience with Daniel's manipulation, suggested we document everything. She still had access to some of Daniel's files from her time as his assistant, including emails and text messages that showed his pattern of predatory behavior toward women. If we could gather enough evidence, maybe we could protect Margaret and warn his future victims. It was risky and probably illegal, but it felt like the right thing to do. Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret stayed with me, sleeping on my couch while we built a case against Daniel. It was strange having her in my space again, but not in the way I had once imagined. She was not my girlfriend anymore, just a person who needed help. During that time I learned things about Daniel that made me sick. Melissa pulled records showing he had paid off at least 3 women to keep quiet about various incidents. He had used his money and power to silence anyone who threatened his reputation. There were photos and videos and messages that painted a picture of a man who viewed people as possessions to acquire and discard. I realized that my friendship with him had been just as transactional as his relationship with Margaret. He had kept me around as the poor friend who made him feel generous and superior. The moment I was no longer useful, he had discarded me without a second thought. Margaret worked on compiling her own evidence, documenting the abuse and control and isolation. She reached out to other women Daniel had dated and found a pattern of similar behavior. Slowly, a picture emerged of a serial manipulator who used his wealth and charm to trap vulnerable people. 1 month after Margaret had left Daniel, we had enough evidence to go public. Melissa knew a journalist at a major New York publication who was interested in stories about abuse of power among the wealthy elite. We met with her at a coffee shop and laid out everything we had found. The journalist, a sharp-eyed woman named Sarah, listened carefully, taking notes and asking pointed questions. "This is good," she said finally, "but we need Daniel to respond. If we publish this and he threatens to sue, we need to be bulletproof. Are you all willing to go on record?" Margaret hesitated, and I understood why. Going public meant destroying any chance of quietly moving on, meant facing Daniel's lawyers and his powerful family, meant potentially sacrificing her career in the art world. But Melissa spoke up. "I will go on record. I have documentation of his harassment toward me when I worked for him, and I have the emails about his other victims." Margaret looked at me, and I saw the woman I had once loved flicker back into her eyes for just a moment. "I will do it too," she said. "He cannot keep getting away with this." The article dropped on a Tuesday morning, and by noon it was trending on every social media platform. The headline read, "Real Estate Heir Daniel Park accused of pattern of abuse and manipulation by multiple women," and the story detailed everything from his treatment of Margaret to his harassment of Melissa to testimonies from 3 other women who had come forward. The journalist had done thorough work, including statements from former employees and business associates that painted a picture of a man who viewed the world as his personal playground. My phone exploded with messages from old friends and colleagues, everyone wanting to know if I had seen the article. I did not respond to most of them, just sat in my apartment, watching the story spread across the internet like wildfire. Daniel's response came within hours, a carefully worded statement from his lawyer, denying all allegations and threatening legal action against anyone who had participated in what he called a coordinated smear campaign by disgruntled former associates. He did not name me or Margaret or Melissa specifically, but the implication was clear. He was coming for us. Margaret panicked when she saw the statement. "What if he sues?" she said. "What if we lose everything?" Melissa, who had been remarkably calm through all of this, said, "We have the truth on our side. That has to count for something." I was not sure I believed that. I had seen too many times how money could bend truth into whatever shape the powerful wanted. But we had made our choice, and there was no going back now. The real turning point came 3 days later when Daniel's cousin Jennifer Park came forward with her own story. Jennifer was a successful lawyer in Boston, and she published an open letter on social media describing how Daniel had sexually harassed her at a family wedding 5 years ago and how the family had covered it up to avoid scandal. Her statement gave other people courage, and suddenly there was a flood of accusations from women who had been afraid to speak up before. Daniel's carefully constructed image as a charming young real estate mogul crumbled in a matter of days. Brands pulled their sponsorships and business partners distanced themselves, and even his own family released a statement, saying they were conducting an internal investigation. I watched it all unfold with a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness. This was not the friend I had grown up with, or maybe it was and I had just been too naive to see it. Either way, the Daniel I thought I knew had never really existed. He had been playing a role this whole time, and I had been a supporting character in his elaborate performance. Margaret was dealing with her own complicated emotions. She gave several interviews talking about her experience and received both support and vicious online harassment from people who accused her of being a gold digger who had gotten what she deserved. I watched her struggle with the public scrutiny, and part of me wanted to protect her, but I knew she had to fight this battle herself. Melissa stood by both of us, navigating the media attention with grace and becoming something of an advocate for abuse survivors in the process. Through all of this, Melissa and I grew closer. She was the steady presence I needed, someone who understood the complexity of what we were going through without judgment or expectation. We would sit up late at night in my cramped studio talking about everything and nothing, eating Chinese takeout, and watching old movies and slowly healing from our respective wounds. I found myself falling for her, not in the desperate, consuming way I had loved Margaret, but in a quieter, deeper way that felt sustainable. She made me laugh and she challenged me, and she never made me feel like I had to be anyone other than myself. One night about 2 months after the article published, I kissed her and she kissed me back, and it felt like coming home after a long journey. Margaret noticed, of course. She was still staying with me, though she had started looking for her own place, and working part-time at a small gallery in Brooklyn that did not care about the scandal. One evening she found Melissa and me sitting close on the couch, Melissa's head on my shoulder, and something shifted in Margaret's expression. "I need to move out," she said abruptly. "It is time." I offered to help her find an apartment, and she shook her head. "No, Robert, you have done enough. More than enough. I need to figure this out on my own." There was a long pause, and then she said, "I am sorry. For everything. For not believing you, and for taking you for granted, and for all of it. I know I do not deserve your forgiveness, but I am sorry anyway." I looked at this woman who had once been my entire world and felt only a distant affection, like remembering a story from someone else's life. "I forgive you, Margaret. I hope you find what you are looking for." She smiled sadly. "I already found it once and I threw it away. But I am glad you found it again." She looked at Melissa. "Take care of him. He is one of the good ones." Melissa nodded. "I know." Margaret moved out the following week into a small apartment in Brooklyn that she was sharing with 2 roommates. It was a far cry from Daniel's penthouse, but she seemed lighter, somehow unburdened by the weight of trying to be someone she was not. We stayed in loose contact, checking in every few weeks, but the intensity of what we had once shared was gone, replaced by a cordial distance that felt appropriate. 6 months after the article published, Daniel's real estate empire was in ruins. Multiple lawsuits had been filed against him, both civil and criminal, and his family had quietly removed him from any leadership positions in their company. He had moved to Los Angeles, apparently trying to reinvent himself in a new city, but his reputation had followed him. I did not take any pleasure in his downfall, only a grim satisfaction that he was finally facing consequences for his actions. Melissa and I moved in together to a 1-bedroom apartment in Astoria that had actual closets and a kitchen where we could both stand at the same time. I landed a major commission designing a community center in the Bronx through connections I had made from the publicity around the Daniel Park scandal, and my career finally started taking off, not because of who I knew but because of the quality of my work. One evening about 8 months after everything had exploded, Margaret called me. I almost did not answer, but Melissa nodded encouragingly, so I picked up. "Hey Robert," Margaret said, and her voice sounded different, stronger somehow. "I just wanted to tell you something. I am moving to Portland. I got offered a position at a gallery there and I think I need a fresh start." "That is great, Margaret," I said, and I meant it. "I also wanted to thank you," she continued, "for helping me when you had every reason not to. For showing me what real kindness looks like. You could have left me to deal with Daniel alone and no one would have blamed you, but you did not. That means more to me than you know." I glanced at Melissa, who was reading a book on the couch, her legs tucked under her, looking perfectly at home in our space. "We all deserved a chance to start over," I said. "I hope Portland is good to you." There was a pause, and then Margaret said, "I heard through the grapevine that Daniel tried to reach out to you last month." My jaw tightened. "He did. Left me a voicemail, saying he wanted to apologize and explain his side of things." I deleted it without listening. "Good," Margaret said. "He does not deserve your time." Then more quietly she added, "For what it is worth, I think you and Melissa make sense together in a way you and I never really did. You both see the world clearly without illusions. I used to think that was depressing, but now I think it is the only way to survive." We said our goodbyes, and I hung up feeling like a chapter had finally closed. Melissa looked up from her book. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," I said, sitting down next to her and pulling her close. "Everything is exactly as it should be." 2 years later, I was standing in the Brooklyn Museum at the opening of a major exhibition that Melissa had coordinated through her nonprofit work. The space was filled with art and music, and people celebrating the intersection of community and creativity. I had designed the exhibition layout working with Melissa to create an immersive experience that told stories of resilience and recovery. As I stood there watching people move through the space, engaging with the art, I felt proud not just of the work but of how far I had come from that night when my world had shattered on Daniel's penthouse floor. My mother was there beaming with pride, as she always did, and some of my colleagues from the architecture firm, and even a few old friends who had stuck by me through everything. Melissa found me in the crowd and took my hand. "You did good," she said. "We did good," I corrected. "This was a team effort." She smiled that smile that had become my favorite thing in the world and kissed me right there in front of everyone. I heard someone nearby whisper, "That is the couple from that Daniel Park scandal," and I did not even care. Let them talk. We had built something real from the ashes of betrayal, and that was worth more than any reputation. As the evening wound down, I saw a familiar figure at the edge of the crowd. Margaret stood alone looking at one of the exhibition pieces that featured stories of abuse survivors. She had cut her hair short and was wearing simple clothes, nothing like the designer outfits from her time with Daniel. She looked like herself again, or maybe like a new version of herself. When she saw me looking, she raised her hand in a small wave. I waved back. She smiled and then disappeared into the crowd, and I knew that was probably the last time I would see her. That night Melissa and I walked home through Brooklyn, the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement from an earlier rain. "So, what is next?" she asked. I thought about it for a moment. I had a good career, a woman I loved, a life that felt authentic and earned. "Keep building," I said. "Keep creating. Keep moving forward." Melissa squeezed my hand. "Sounds perfect." And it was. Not because everything had worked out exactly as I had once imagined, but because I had learned that sometimes the life you build after everything falls apart is better than the one you were clinging to. Margaret had left me for a millionaire who used her and threw her away, but in doing so she had freed me to find something real. I did not thank her for that, but I did not hate her anymore either. She was just another person trying to figure out life, making mistakes and hopefully learning from them. As for Daniel, I heard he was still in Los Angeles, still trying to rebrand himself, still convinced that with enough money he could buy back his reputation. Some people never learn. But that was not my problem anymore. I had my own life to live, and it was a good one.